So then all we do, you just take your torch or your lighter, whatever you got, and just kind of wave it along. You don't need a lot of heat. This torch kind of gets a little excited sometimes, so you just kind of gotta put just enough heat to get it shrunk. You also can do this with a heat gun. Again, I don't have one here, so using what we got. And then make sure you get all the way around it. You want that heat shrunk, good and shrunk. And if you did it right, you'll end up with something that looks like that. Almost a near factory looking joint. One that's going to be very strong. I mean, you know, you can pull on that as much as you want. It's not going to come apart. It's one of the best ways that I've found, and then all I do is then just put it back. In my case, I'm pulling them out of the connector because it's really easy to. You don't have to, but it makes it a lot easier to get the heat shrink on. If you don't, you have to somehow fish it from whatever other end. You need to have one end open, basically. If not, you can do like what I did on this one, where the connector did not want to come apart entirely, and I did the same type of joint, except I just wrapped this one with electrical tape, and again a little bit more liquid electrical tape in the joint, just to seal it up good, because I couldn't get the heat shrink around it. So that's kind of the way you can do it. And then the next step is, in my case, I'm extending wires here. I am extending the wires coming out of this plug, because all the wires are different lengths because of what they're expecting you to put it in. So in our case, what we're just going to do is trim back a little bit of the excess, because I didn't quite know how much wire I was going to need. And we're going to strip this just like you would normally. Get that jacketing off. So we'll end up with two ends. They're stripped. Now, in order to get this jointed, very simple. All you're going to do is just take them, put them together and twist them. Now, before you do that though, if you're going to use heat shrink, you got to put the heat shrink on. So if you're not going to use heat shrink and you're just going to electrical tape them, which you can, it's just not as good in my opinion. You obviously don't need to put the heat shrink on, but heat shrink goes on first, and then we're just going to kind of incorporate them together, and then give them kind of a twisting where you're trying to kind of do a ringing action almost, because you're trying to twist one half. You're trying to do this, twist one half one way, one half the other way. And all that is just trying to do is kind of anchor these wires together solid enough to where they'll hold together while you solder them. So we'll take the solder, and also I'm using a smaller solder for these smaller wires. I have a bigger roll of solder over there, bigger diameter for the bigger wires. You don't have to, but it uses a lot of this small solder if you do. So I recommend using a bigger roll for a bigger diameter wire. And again, you want just a very, very low flame. That's just that flux burning off. And this one I didn't quite strip off as enough coating, so has a little bit of the insulation that burned a little bit, but nothing too detrimental. Good solid solder joint. Slide your heat shrink over once it's cooled enough. And I know some of y'all are going to say you should just leave the torch on, and I would, except for this torch is also having issues staying running, where it'll just randomly shut off, and then you'll look over and the torch is just sitting there spewing propane out, not burnt. So I've been trying to shut it off as regularly as I can, just, you know, for safety purposes. But this is pretty much all there is to it. It's nothing really that fancy. It's a good way to do this on a fairly cheap budget. I mean, the most expensive stuff here is just the heat shrink, honestly, and it's not that expensive even. The wire is, if you're splicing it, you're either going to do crimp connectors, which they make waterproof crimp connectors, but they're not really, in my opinion, that great for long term. They're great in terms of patching if you need to just get by, for a little while and you don't want them to get wet. They work great, but for long term stuff, they're not that great. The Scotch locks, open crimp connectors, the cheap ones you buy at like the dollar store or whatever, all those I really don't recommend, just because they are not only very poor quality, they just do not seal, in my opinion, at all, worth any kind of reasonable amount. And unless the only thing that in my opinion, that they're really good for is in an extreme emergency, if you need to really patch something up and that's all you have. But this, in my opinion, is a much better way to do it that will last and last and last. I've been doing this. I learned this about 5-6 years ago, and all the things that I've been doing it on I haven't had any issues with the connection since then. And I've several trucks that have bolt connected things or crimp connected things that after a very short period of time they start going bad. So that's just my opinion. That's just something I thought I'd share. I've had several people ask me kind of how I do this in the past, just working on other people's trucks, and it seems to be something that people have interest in. So if y'all find this interesting, I don't post a whole lot about some of this stuff, but stuff like this that I think somebody might have an interest in or might help somebody, I try to put out there. So yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Put it in the comments, and I thank you much for watching. Bye.